Lucius Mummius Achaicus, Consul 146 BCE, Censor 142 BCE. Mummius is primarily known as the Roman consul who brought about the destruction of Corinth in 136, thus ending the Achaean League, Rome's former ally turned enemy. That same year, Scipio Aemilianus led the Roman forces which destroyed the city of Carthage in North Africa, the seat of Rome's old enemy. With the destruction of these two cities, Rome found itself without a credible external threat. And this is one of the major events in the transition between the Middle and Late Republic. It was largely recognized as such in antiquity, but the Romans tended to look at it in much more moralistic terms. This was when Rome effectively became degenerate. Without that external threat to stimulate virtue, the Romans became more greedy and grasping, and their political system fell into ruin, or at least that is the Roman view of this. In this video, what I want to do is to look at Mummius's career, and I will be looking at it in parallel with that of Scipio Aemilianus because I believe that Mummius is something of a victim of Scipio's revisionist history. Now, Scipio was not only a well-connected patrician who was effectively the scion of two of the most important patrician houses in Rome, but he also led a group of cultured men and scholars who were responsible for transmitting Roman culture and historical memory to succeeding generations. Therefore, his portrait of Mummius would be the definitive one, and I think that the portrait we have of Mummius is one which is marked by class prejudice. Yes, even though they were both consuls and censors, Scipio did feel that he was superior to Mummius because he had a better pedigree, and also simply because Scipio did not want to give his rival too much credit. So he embarked upon something of a silent smear campaign through his friends and the people who served as his clients. But I'll explore all of this as we go along in this video. As always, we'll begin with Mummius's early life and then work our way through to the end of his career. Lucius Mummius came from a plebeian family, which was probably new to Roman politics. We don't really have any evidence of anyone else with the surname Mummius being involved in Roman politics prior to Lucius. This means that not only was he a new man in the sense that he had no one in his family who had ever held the consulship, but he was also a novus homo in the most literal way possible. Lucius was born somewhere between 200 and 190 BCE. His status as a novus homo and the 7-year period which elapsed between his praetorship and his consulship suggest that as someone who didn't have very many political connections, he did not advance up the cursus of norm at anywhere near an optimal rate. So my suspicion is that he would have been born closer to 200 than the 190, and that he would have been nearly 10 years older than some of his more well-connected peers when they reached high office. Lucius also had a younger brother named Spurius. Spurius was not as interested in politics as his older brother, and as we'll see, he would one day go on to kind of betray Lucius in a way which must have hurt pretty bad. The half-century or so following the Second Punic War was arguably the greatest period of Roman expansion and military prowess. During this time, the Romans expanded into Spain, they gained territory in southern Gaul, and they also began to acquire considerable portions of the Balkans, a process that Mummius himself would later finish, not to spoil the ending too much. Yet during this period, what we see is that the wealth that came into Italy, this unprecedented amount of wealth, went almost exclusively, or at least overwhelmingly, to the elite. And despite the expansion of the elite and new families gaining enough wealth to compete, political power contracted into fewer and fewer hands. Families which were already well connected and had famous names, had previous office holders in their ranks, continued to rack up the offices and honors, whereas outsiders who were now wealthy enough to enter had no real opportunity. There were very few new families reaching the consulship during the 2nd century. By the time Mummius was eligible to run, we're talking about a 40-year dry spell of new men reaching the consulship, which is a very long time compared to most of the rest of Roman history, both before and after. Young Mummius was possibly the first in his family to ever enter in the Roman politics, and given the context of his time, he could not have possibly thought that he would ever have a reasonable chance of reaching the consulship. So he probably thought his career might culminate in a praetorship, and that if he were able to reach that high, then this would be a major building block for his sons or grandsons to build upon and try to claim the ultimate prize at some point in the future. We don't have any surviving evidence about Mummius's first 2 offices, or whether or not he chose to serve as tribune. All we know is that he first appears in history in 153 when he's elected praetor, which actually means, of course, he was elected in 154 and then served in 153. He probably thought going into this office that this would be the pinnacle of his career. This was as high as someone with his level of name recognition and clout would ever be able to reach. It was pretty rare for praetors to receive opportunities to acquire fame, glory, and riches. Whenever there was really an opportune moment which would arise, typically the Senate would assign it to a consul, especially if this opportunity would involve the command of a large force of men. Luckily for Mummius, however, there was a revolt during his time as praetor, and it took place in further Spain. He was ordered to suppress it. Since Spain was something of a quagmire which led to embarrassment for any number of commanders, the consuls weren't all that eager to get themselves involved. And it wasn't exactly an ideal opportunity for Mummius either, but it was an opportunity, and anytime you are in the army with the field, you have a puncher's chance of acquiring some kind of acclaim. Mummius was going to take that chance. The situation in Iberia was this. The Lusitanians, one of the largest tribes, and one which was particularly concentrated in the west, what is now mostly Portugal and parts of western Spain, were in revolt. And their revolt meant that there would be opportunities for large-scale battles where Mummius could either win glory or potentially face a crushing defeat. Even a crushing defeat, however, would not be all that politically damaging and most likely would not have changed his fortunes one way or another. However, a victory could potentially be a difference maker, especially if it's a large victory. The Lusitanians at this time were under a leader who called himself Punicus. This is a reference to the Carthaginians who had an influence in Spain prior to being ejected by the Romans during the Second Punic War. And Punicus had already proven himself to be a real menace to Roman control in Iberia. He had defeated 2 Roman praetors and killed about 6,000 soldiers prior to Mummius's arrival. When Mummius arrived, he gathered up 14,000 men and marched into the interior, hoping to seek a battle early and win on the field against the Lusitanians. The new Lusitanian leader, Punicus had died, was Caesarus, and he himself needed to prove his leadership to his own men, so he was eager to oblige Mummius and grant him the land battle that both of them wanted. When the battle started, Mummius and his Romans got off to a great start. They were able to put Caesarus to flight, and the Romans were then in pursuit. Things were looking good, but the pursuit became disordered, and the Lusitanians were able to turn the tables with a devastating counterattack. During this counterattack, Mummius lost not only the battle, but a good portion of his army. He lost around 9,000 men and all of his legionary standards. These standards were then paraded amongst the Celtiberians to advertise the success of Caesarus and the Lusitanians, and hopefully to encourage other tribes to join this revolt. The situation was dire, and the worst had happened for Mummius. Fortunately for Roman interests in the area, however, Mummius was not the kind of guy to give up easily, and he began to move to recover as soon as he got his men back together. Mummius took his forces to the coast and began to regroup. Coasts were always a good place for Roman armies to retreat to, since the Romans tended to dominate the sea, especially when they were fighting rebels or groups which did not have organized navies, like the Lusitanians. While many commanders would have been completely disheartened by this defeat and would have just sat in camp and waited to be relieved, Mummius was in no way deterred by this defeat, and he was yet eager to restore the situation. He began to drill his men until he was able to reestablish discipline, and then he marched back into the interior looking for an opportunity to win some redemption. A Lusitanian army marched nearby, loaded down with plunder and some of the lost standards that they were showing off to the Celtiberians. Mummius's army fell upon them while they were loaded down with this plunder, and they were able to inflict many losses and reclaim some of the lost standards and a good number of their old camp goods. The combination of the training on the coast and then this victory helped to restore the combat effectiveness and morale of Mummius's army. He was now back in the struggle, and the Lusitanian revolt had suffered a setback which helped to offset the defeat that Mummius had suffered earlier. The game was now on. While Mummius's victory was significant, the overall tide of the conflict was still in favor of the Lusitanians. Another Lusitanian leader was encouraged by Roman weakness to invade a Roman subject people, the Cuni, and to capture their capital. After this, some of this Lusitanian force crossed Gibraltar into Africa in order to plunder there, while the bulk of them laid siege to Ocile, another city in Iberia. Using 9,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, it would seem that Mummius's force had grown, either by recruiting more locals or because he was reinforced at some point. Mummius decided to march on Ocile and relieve the city. Whether by design or by happy accident, Mummius was able to catch the besiegers unaware and engaged in plundering the countryside. He then was able to sneak up behind them and inflict a heavy defeat on an army of 15,000 Lusitanians, thus saving the city of Ocile from Lusitanian hands. Mummius's twin victories in Iberia over the Lusitanians put the Romans in good stead to move forward and finish crushing the revolt. His successors did just that. In the meantime, Mummius returned to Rome, and he was rewarded with a triumph. The Senate was deeply impressed by what he had accomplished, and they were especially impressed by the fact that he had shown such perseverance. In many ways, the Romans defined themselves by their determination and their grit, and Mummius had shown this in greater quantities than almost anyone else had in a very long time. The triumph he received for his deeds in further Spain was rare and almost unique. It was exceedingly rare for a praetor to win a triumph. They normally didn't have the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier. The minimum requirement for a triumph is that you have to slay 5,000 or more enemies in battle. It's also rare for a novus homo to be put in a position to have an opportunity to win a triumph, whether that novus homo is a consul or a praetor. So for Mummius to do this as both a novus homo and a praetor was quite exceptional. Even most consuls from noble plebeian or patrician families rarely achieve this, and a noble plebeian family, of course, is one which has produced a consul in the past. So this is something which should make Mummius a household name. And we also have to keep in mind that anytime there's a triumph, there were parades, games, and feasts, and this means that the common people of Rome, the people who voted at elections, would know Mummius's name and face and keep him in mind for the future when they were deciding to vote for consul. Yet, as we'll see, this did not have quite as large of an impact on voting behavior as you might expect. Typically, based on the cursus honorum, anyone who was old enough to hold the praetorship would be eligible to run for consul a mere 3 years later. However, in the case of Mummius, he wouldn't be elected consul until 7 years later in 146. Mummius was elected plebeian consul for that year alongside the patrician Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus. However, Cornelius would not play a big role that year because he stayed in Rome while Mummius went to Greece. Elsewhere in Africa, the consul of the previous year, Scipio Aemilianus, was still busy fighting Carthage. Mummius was the first novus homo to reach the consulship in 40 years. He and his colleague must have appeared on paper to be a pretty big step down from the consuls of 147, who included Gaius Livius Drusus, someone from a fairly well-known family, and also Scipio Aemilianus, the heir, as I said earlier, to both the Scipio family and the Aemilian family, which had been responsible for the conquest of Macedon in 168. Also, the grandfather of Scipio Aemilianus, at least by adoption, was one of the consuls who had lost the Battle of Cannae. Perhaps actually was his great-grandfather. But we're not talking about Aemilianus, are we? At any rate, Rome at this time had an ongoing war with both the Greeks and in Macedon, where there was a rebellion. But this conflict was well in hand. When Mummius was sent to Greece to clean things up, he was coming in as a mop-up guy, not as someone who was inheriting a fresh, boiling-over crisis. So once again, his opportunities for achieving any kind of everlasting or great fame were somewhat limited, and he would find himself getting fairly lucky. By the time that Mummius arrived in the Balkans, he found that the war in Macedon had already been settled militarily and administratively by another overachieving praetor, Quintus Caecilius Metellus, who for his efforts in Macedon earned the cognomen Macedonicus. Had Mummius been better connected when he was praetor, he may very well have earned the cognomen Ibericus or Ocenius or something along those lines for his deeds, but he didn't because, well, he wasn't as well connected. Metellus was then ordered south to join Mummius as he marched on the Achaean League. A little bit of background on the Achaean League. This was an organization, a league of cities, which had been a long-time Roman ally, helping them in their wars against the Aetolian League, Macedon, and Sparta at various times. However, now that all of those entities were defeated, Rome wanted the league to die off, and so when some of the members of the Achaean League began to withdraw from the organization, Rome forbade the Achaean League from trying to compel them by force to remain loyal. The League decided that this was unacceptable and they couldn't just allow themselves to die. They began to try to suppress the rebels. Rome then found them to be a threat to Roman security and declared war. By the time that Mummius arrived, Metellus' forces were preparing for a final clash with the Achaeans, who were massing at Corinth, which was effectively the capital of the Achaean League at this time. Mummius, of course, took command, and now it would be he, rather than Metellus Macedonicus, who would be commanding in the decisive battle. When Mummius marched to the vicinity of Corinth, he was met by the Achaean forces under the League strategos Dionysus. Dionysus marched out and offered battle, thinking that his best chance was to beat the Romans outright. However, Mummius was able to win, and it seems to have been mostly an easy victory. Dionysus then retreated and himself fled to his home city of Megalopolis. He committed suicide along with his wife, and without him, the League had no real leadership. This means that it would have been relatively easy for Mummius to talk to the garrison of Corinth and arrange a surrender. However, this was not done. In some of our sources, the implication is that Mummius was some kind of bloodthirsty tyrant who just wanted to sack the city so that he could loot it. However, it seems more than likely that he was acting on explicit instructions from the Senate, which was in a rather bloodthirsty mood in 146, and that their instructions were to take the city by storm and inflict maximum damage. Therefore, Mummius did not engage in any negotiations for the city's surrender, although we have plenty of evidence that the citizens of the city were more than willing to give up the struggle. He moved in slow motion as he began to prepare this grand assault. Part of the reason he did this was to lower the number of defenders. While he was approaching, he let it be known subtly that any Corinthians who needed to flee could pass through his lines unmolested. So most of the population of Corinth actually decided to take their things and flee, and they just passed right through the Roman lines as Mummius was approaching. Whether this was to thin out the garrison or whether it was because he disagreed with the orders from Rome to take the city by force regardless of whether surrender was possible is anyone's guess. As I mentioned earlier, once Dionysus was defeated at Corinth, he fled to Megalopolis and committed suicide with his wife. Without Dionysus, there was no field army for the Achaeans, and their remaining forces concentrated behind the walls of Corinth to await the Roman attack. I imagine the desertion rate from the ranks of the Achaean army had to be high simply because so many Corinthians were already fleeing that it couldn't have been that hard for a soldier to shed his uniform and then join the stream of people who were fleeing from the city. The Romans then proceeded to overrun the remaining defenders of Corinth, and they killed and enslaved the population which had chosen to remain. Once he was in Corinth, Mummius oversaw one of the most notorious sacks in all of Roman history, if not the most notorious sack of them all. Mummius's men stole everything of value, including a treasure trove of priceless art, and after they had looted the city thoroughly of all of the culturally valuable artifacts, they then burned the city to the ground. The Sack of Corinth marked the official end of the Achaean League, and Greece was absorbed into the new province of Macedonia. One well-known story in the historian Polybius's work claims that the Romans were so uncultured and disrespectful to Greek culture that when they had valuable artwork laying on the ground, they played dice on top of it, and this led to the rise of the phrase "nothing to the Dionysus," which effectively means that someone is a real Philistine who has no appreciation for art and culture. Dionysus, of course, was the god that the Athenians had dedicated many of their drama festivals to. This behavior, paired with the brutal sack of Corinth and Mummius's novus homo status, led to a lot of characterizations of the consul as being unread and uncultured. I believe this was driven by Scipio Aemilianus. One thing we'll explore is that one of the prominent members of the Scipionic circle was none other than the Greek historian Polybius. Not only would he have been furious about this treatment of Greek cultural artifacts, but also Polybius was apparently not on great terms with Mummius himself, and he had been a tutor for Scipio Aemilianus. And as I mentioned, Scipio Aemilianus and Mummius were political rivals, especially after the events of 146. So he had every reason in the world to paint Mummius in a negative light, and also perhaps to exaggerate to some extent the brutality of the Romans. Another story from this time is that Mummius supposedly told the Romans moving priceless ancient art that if they broke or damaged it, they would have to replace it. I just can't imagine that a guy who was a member of the ruling class in Rome, who had to have been well educated, would say something along those lines. That just does not seem in keeping with Mummius's social position, and it also doesn't correspond with the care that he took to try to assuage Greek feelings after the sack of Corinth. So let's take a look at what he did after the fall of Corinth. For the most part, the characterization of Mummius that sticks in people's minds is as the guy who oversaw the sack of Corinth and then behaved like a moron while he was trying to take the artwork from Corinth back to Rome. However, if we take his time in Greece as a whole, we see that he spent most of his remaining time as consul and then his entire time as proconsul once his command was renewed, trying to bring about peace and being very respectful of the feelings of his new Greek subjects. Following the advice of Polybius, who traveled with him or joined him at some point, Mummius ensured that the great heroes of old, even Achaean League legends like Aratus and Philippaemen, were properly honored and that sacred objects were returned to appropriate sites throughout the Greek world. Polybius also was someone who was one of the members of the elite of the Achaean League, and he had been in exile in Rome for a long time, So he was related to some of the great men of the Achaean League and had a strong personal interest in making sure that their memory was preserved. In particular, I believe that Polybius had some kind of relationship with Philippamen. I forget exactly what it is. Aratus, by this point, had been dead for a long time, so Polybius would have never met him, but he was kind of the great figure of Achaean League history. So he would be someone that Polybius definitely revered, and in his narrative about the Achaean League, we definitely see that reverence on display. When we think about the totality of Mummius' strategy for keeping Greece in line, we see that there is a pretty artful, if you'll pardon the pun, combination of terror from Corinth's destruction and also a lot of reconciliation, as Mummius showed respect for Greek sensibilities and all aspects of life. He basically allowed them local autonomy to a large extent. They just had to obey their governor, pay taxes, and otherwise they were left to do more or less whatever they had done before outside of the political sphere. In fact, under Roman leadership from the time of Mummius forward well into the empire, Greek cities were free enough that they could actually fight small border wars against one another to fight over boundaries. So the Roman rulership of Greece was hardly harsh, and Mummius found a solution which would prove to be quite enduring. When he returned home, Mummius was given the cognomen Achaicus. The real significance of this is that he was the first new man ever to receive a cognomen. Before, any novus homo who won the consulship or even a triumph would not have received the cognomen for his deeds. However, as we saw, Metellus Macedonicus got his cognomen for putting down a small rebellion that was not well organized or armed. So these were being given out rather liberally at the time. This actually leads me to think that perhaps one of the reasons why the Senate was being so generous with cognomens in 146 was to try to offset the prestige of Scipio Aemilianus, who was becoming the grand figure of the era at a young age, similar to what his ancestor Scipio Africanus had achieved. And the senators were never comfortable with the idea of one senator being vastly superior to all of them in prestige and honors. So by spreading honors around, they helped to offset all the great gains that Scipio Aemilianus had made. And perhaps this helped to feed this rivalry between these two men that would form over the next few years. Despite the supposed lack of culture that Mummius had, and his lack of interest in the arts of Dionysus, upon his return, one of the first things that Mummius did was to build a magnificent new theater to keep the public entertained, i.e. to put on the arts of Dionysus, plays, etc. Mummius's new theater, modeled on theaters he had seen in Greece, featured improved acoustics and seating when compared to previous Roman efforts. This was a big step forward, and the theater of Pompey featured here would not have been possible without the earlier theater of Mummius. So he changed the game forever when it came to public entertainment in Rome. Such was his devotion to Dionysus in reality. We don't know a whole lot about Mummius's career after he returned and built his theater, aside from his time as censor in 142. This was his final honor, and he was elected alongside of Scipio Aemilianus, the other great destroyer of the 140s. The two men did not work well together as censor, as each of them had a different vision for what to do with the office. Scipio Aemilianus was a strict disciplinarian when it came to morality, and he thought that it was his job to combat luxury and immorality by expelling members of the Senate who were not up to his personal moral standards. Mummius, however, does not seem to have entertained such notions, and he opposed Scipio Aemilianus's efforts. Perhaps Mummius was seeking support among his fellow senators, and this is why he was more lenient with them. At any rate, it is fascinating that this patrician was trying to purge the Senate, while Mummius was effectively trying to defend the institution against change. Mummius, of course, is sort of the exception that proves the rule that the Senate was a closed order, and yet he wants to keep it the way it is. Scipio Aemilianus, however, was someone who had most things handed to him. Not to say he wasn't brilliant in his own right, he was. And then he was determined to really reform this institution. It's a fascinating dynamic, and the conflict here must have been very intense and really just interesting. I wish we knew more about the details of this conflict, but unfortunately we don't. Now for the legacy and significance of Mummius. Mummius's rise to the top during the 2nd century was an important exception to the rule that only men with famous names and well-connected families could rise to the top of Roman politics. Mummius was able to do it through a combination of opportunity and ability. One important thing about all of that is that Rome's self-perception was always as a meritocracy. The idea being that anyone who was elected to this office had earned an honor, and that honor set them apart from other people. Now sure, people recognized that you had to possess a certain amount of wealth to attain these honors in the first place, or even to run for them, but once you attained them, these honors were treated as if they were objective measures of ability. And the fact that Mummius was able to rise out of nowhere and achieve all that he did is an example they could point to that they weren't a closed society, and that these offices were open to anyone who had sufficient ability. It was largely a lie, no less after Mummius than before him, but it was an example they could point to and something that they could use to convince themselves that the meritocracy was real. The grit which Mummius displayed against the Lusitanians is the very definition of Romanitas, Romanness. He showed grit in the face of adversity. Rather than giving up, he believed in his men and he believed in Rome. He reformed, he marched out again, sought battle once again, and was victorious. It was probably his belief in Rome and his grit and determination that earned him a triumph as a mere praetor, rather than the actual brilliance of his deeds. As for Lucius's brother Spurius, who I said earlier committed a heartbreaking betrayal, Spurius, while he did serve under his brother in Greece, mostly committed his life to writing comical letters. These were basically fictional letters he would compose that were supposed to be funny. No surviving examples have survived, but Spurius was one of the great masters of this format, which kind of seemed to die out maybe 100 or 200 years later. At any rate, Spurius, because of his cultured interest, was actually a member of the Scipionic circle. As we've discussed, Lucius was not. So it's possible that one of the ways that the Scipionic circle justified their portrayal of Lucius as an uncultured brute was by pointing to the membership of his brother in their circle. And I have to think that for Lucius Mummius, this was a major betrayal on the part of his brother. And while we don't have any direct evidence, I can't help but think that the two men were not on very good terms with one another. At any rate, though, Mummius had no heirs, and the Mummius family did not go on to achieve too much. That being said, Mummius is still an important figure for the history of the 2nd century. His conquest of Greece is still one of the watershed moments in Roman history, and that's something that no one, not even Scipio Aemilianus or the historian Polybius, can take away from him.